Well, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I think, first of all, I would like to thank AmCham, MENA, for hosting this and organizing this beautiful conference. Yesterday, we really had the privilege to discuss a lot of the concepts post-COVID. We discussed, healthcare, we discussed innovation, and most importantly, the growth of trade post-COVID. It has been very enlightening to hear a lot of the speakers and what they had to add, what they had to mention. And today it is a privilege actually to start today's meetings with another equally very interesting sector, which is the logistics sector. As you know, logistics has been in the limelight in the pandemic. A lot of issues came up. A lot of people started talking about logistics and the effects of logistics in everyday life. I would like to take first the opportunity to introduce our speakers, Mrs. Abir Lahita, Mr. Ma'moon Touan, and unfortunately I was just informed that Mr. Mohsen had to apologize for attending the session. He has an urgent issue. I would like to start actually giving the floor to the speakers first to introduce themselves for a couple of minutes, and then we will probably start our discussion. Ms. Abir, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you. I'm really very happy and honored to be here. It's my first time in Jordan. It's a very beautiful country, and I'm very happy to be here with AmCham. My name is Abir Lahita. I am chairman and CEO of EG-Trans. EG-Trans is one of the leading transport and logistics service providers in Egypt. Next year we will turn 50 years old. And we've been listed on the stock exchange for 20 years. Our main activity is freight forwarding and project logistics.
Ma'moon?
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, AmCham, for having us. So it's an honor to be here. My name is Ma'moon Touan. I work in the shipping and logistics sector as well. I do have or wear several hats during the day. So one is acting as business development for a shipping and logistics company based in Jordan. It's a family business that does also some freight forwarding, shipping agency. And then I am the co-founder and a partner in a tech company called ArcFlow, and our mission is basically to help create visibility across the supply chain through making it easy for different partners to collaborate. So like the shipper, freight forwarder, the consignees. It's definitely an interesting time to be in this sector, as Noura stated, sorry. I mean, we've seen, it's been like a roller coaster. Yeah, thank you.
Cool. I think when we talk about logistics and we look at it in the past 2 years, we have seen several worldwide disruptions that have started in 2020. Yani to start with them, we had the massive lockdown across the world. We had shortages in demand and then a hype in demand. We had supply chain congestions. We had the Suez Canal blockage. We had the electronic chip related issues and shortage, which led to basically shortages and disruptions across several industries. And then we had issues like truck driver strikes in parts of the world. And today we are faced, after we thought that everything now is over, we're back into track. All of a sudden we face the Russian-Ukrainian war and all of the sanctions and embargo that is going on, or the talks about it. And to complete the saga, yesterday we've heard, or 2 days before, we've heard about the closure of the Shenzhen port in China, which people today are predicting that actually the aftermath of that would be even worse than the blockage that happened in the Suez Canal. I think one of the issues that keep rising is that when is this going to end? And is this actually a new world norm where we need to plan for disruptions? So it's a very interesting question to ask ourselves. Ms. Abir, I would like to start with you and your remarks on what was the effect of the pandemic on the global value and logistics disruptions?
I think that, as you said, it really started with the pandemic, but now we're 2 years in, and maybe the pandemic itself is waning, but we are still living in continuous disruptions, from congestion at ports, from shortages in container equipment. Freight rates have gone insanely high in some lanes, maybe 10 times as high as before. And I do think that a part of that will gradually settle down, but there are some new trends, there are some changes in the market and the way things are being done that will continue with us. And I would summarize the changes in 4 main areas. I think the first area is that really supply chain is now on the table. It has now become a focus at the C-suite and board levels. And Chief Supply Chain Officer is now a really important partner in any organization. The second thing is that really business continuity has become even more important than cost, because for a very long time, all of the initiatives for innovation, for process improvement, for many things, were focused on efficiency and on productivity and cost reduction. And while those things are continue to be very important, and they continue to drive investment and digitalization and other areas of development, now it's more about how do we achieve resilience, how do we achieve flexibility, how do we find ways to make our supply chains more local, more regional, how do we decrease our dependence on specific places like China, for example. And I think that a recent survey showed that about 60% of companies are now really seeking to have special risk management practices related to their supply chains. I think the third area where there's been a big change is in buyer-supplier relationships, because consumers themselves are changing. There's more of a desire for very quick and on-time delivery, and that can only be done through strong distribution networks. And it's becoming more and more necessary to have more inventory closer to the end consumer. And logistics providers are realizing that sometimes they have to invest in more risky nodes on those distribution networks where they don't necessarily have guaranteed guaranteed flows, and they also, new models are coming up, like having more of a flexible footprint, so that if you have a certain node, you can grow the size of it or decrease it depending on the ebbs and flows of demand. And the last trend, I think, that was very significant, and I don't know if this one will continue or not, is that workarounds for the supply chain are becoming the standard. Companies that have a lot at stake cannot afford to wait for supply chain snarls to kind of clear up in their own time. So we're hearing about retailers who are creating more and more of their own warehouses, companies that cannot find carriage on ocean liners are starting to charter their own vessels or planes. Companies that rely on online commerce are actually acquiring fulfillment operators. You know, companies are moving on and they're finding solutions.
Thank you. I think you've pointed a lot of things that have actually changed the way the logistics sector has been operating for many years. And these trends, it will be an insight to see if they will actually continue or will stop. But one of the points that you have mentioned is actually how the logistics sector is now trying to find new routes to ship cargo versus the old routes that we have been used to for decades. Mr. Ma'moon, I'd leave the floor to you to remark on this issue.
So yeah, Ms. Sabir has pointed out a lot of interesting trends. And I'd like to add that I think a result of what's going on is the world has become more interconnected, more globalized. We rely a lot on our suppliers to deliver. And this pandemic has really showed where the cracks are in the supply chain. And not just for when it comes to sourcing, but also within like the company itself, right? Certain processes maybe were done manually, but now companies are trying to apply certain digital transformations within these processes. And to circle back to your point on, to comment on sourcing of, sorry, I lost the trade of, right, so regional trade is definitely, or should be definitely highlighted. There's been a lot of disruptions in China, disruptions in the US, or in Europe, but then it's time for businesses to rely on the regional partners and maybe like they can't on local suppliers, but it's a call for a regional collaboration.
Yes, I think this actually drives us to our next question about regional collaboration. But one thing you've mentioned is supply chain, and I think now we're looking more of the theme of supply chain as a supply network. So it is really a very complex network that one part of the network affects the complete network. I know Mr. Mohsen is not with us, but it was a very important example what happened with Dubai South. So Dubai South in the past 10 years has seen explosive growth in terms of world-class logistics, world-class warehouses. You have the big players like IKEA, Amazon, and so on. They are all present in Dubai South. And that's, I've personally tried that. I was in Oman and I tried to order from IKEA, and IKEA actually fulfills the request from their Dubai South warehouse. So examples of this regional collaboration and how actually having the availability of a port like Jebel Ali near Dubai South creates a big incentive for having these warehouses become a regional hub, and the facilities and the facilitation that the government actually gives you as a logistics player. How do you think that adds to the transportation trends, especially across regions?
Okay. I think that the development of a transport system and economic development really go hand in hand. Having a transport system in place across a region is what drives growth, what can drive job creation, improve poverty, a lot of different aspects. And investment in transport in particular yields very big returns. I think there was an estimate recently that if you are able to really create sustainable mobility for both passengers and cargo, that would lead by 2050 to a saving of about $70 trillion. If we can just think of that impact, whether it's in terms of vehicles or fuel consumption or just inefficiencies and operational expenses, congestion, lots of different factors that can be improved. So maybe if we talk about intra-regional trade, I want to focus a little bit on Africa, because that's where Egypt is focused at the moment. The intra-regional trade in Africa, the UNCTAD estimated it in 2015 to 2017 at about 2%. And if you compare that to places like Europe, America, Asia, that is more on the range of 47 to 67% intra-regional trade. And so just improving something like that would have a huge impact on the economies of all of those countries. And it would draw in more business for also small and medium enterprises. And that has very big implications for the populations of those countries. And so just the new trade agreements like the CFTA, in that alone is estimated to have an economic gain in the next few years of about, I think, $450 billion. And just, out of that, 290 billion would come simply from trade facilitation, from improving customs procedures between those different countries. So I think that's very important to look at infrastructure, to look at trade facilitation, to look at e-logistics. I mean, what you were mentioning about art flow and how to make the entire supply chain visible and make all of these entities across also countries work together and be able to see each other's contributions to the supply chain is a game changer.
Definitely, and I just want to add to that, or actually think together. One of the biggest issues that are today hindering regional trade is the transportation routes and the borders and the procedures at the borders. So I think as people who advocate for easier, I mean, I'm a big advocate for easier border procedures. I think that's the only way we can actually enhance regional trade. I mean, when you look at it, cargo going from, for example, from Jordan to, I mean, Egypt is a close by. We have one border, so it's not that of an issue. But when you are crossing multiple borders, the amount of paperwork that needs to be done, the difference in customs procedures that is actually present, this creates a big hindrance for cross-regional trade. And I think as AmCham and AmCham members, I think this is one of the biggest issues that we need to start discussing. I know we've been already discussing it for years, but as Mamoun mentioned, today everybody's looking closer to the region to create the supply of goods. Countries, there are big countries in this region and there are smaller. Jordan, for example, being one of the smaller countries, we cannot have everything within our borders. We need to depend on the region to actually create this growth and create this demand. And the only way, really, I see that we can do it is by easing the border procedures. So just to add to what we have said, Mamoun.
Yeah, so I'd like to add on to that. So a few years back, I as I was telling you earlier, did a study on, and we published a paper, on how ports are impacted from policy making done outside the terminal, right? So for instance, a terminal might be run by a big international operator, but then there are certain policies, from customs or inspection authorities that come into play after the container has gated out. So what I'm saying is basically policymakers and also business owners should start to look at the supply chain from a holistic angle. So it's no longer just, I just want to move from A to B. I want to know, what does the workflow, or like what does the transportation flow looks like, and where are the bottlenecks and the cracks. And this is one thing that, going back to the pandemic, that has highlighted, for instance, like in the early days, they say, let's do a full lockdown, right? But, we'll keep the ports open. But then the ports can't operate without the transporters. But then the transporters, they can't operate without the customs broker, who can't operate without the shipping agents or someone at the warehouse to unload the cargo. So it's a full chain, and I think, business owners, policymakers, AmCham, it's a really good idea to start having workshops on those, finding ways where there's a lot of inefficiencies, and ways that we can improve the flow of cargo and the flow of information even.
That's right. And one of the things we have been talking about yesterday and today, and always is a point, is the role of the private sector. How can the private sector drive the change? And how much impact can the private sector have on this change? And within the transportation and logistics sector, we have seen a lot of PPP projects in most of the MENA region. Egypt actually is one of the Egyptian government is one of the biggest, I think, catalysts today for PPP projects, especially in the infrastructure area, maybe less in the services. But where do you see the role of the private sector in enhancing the growth within and basically increasing the potential of the transportation sector, especially within the region as well?
Well, I think that we need to realize that the sheer amount of investment needed to create that kind of sustainable mobility that I was talking about, that can have such a huge impact, is quite large. In 2012, the World Bank did a study, and they estimated that the MENA region needs an investment in infrastructure for transport of about $75 to $100 billion in the next 20 years. I think if they repeated that study today, then the number would be much, much, bigger than that. And governments cannot do that alone, and nor can the private sector. I think they have to work together. And I think in Egypt there was really that realization, and the Ministry of Planning has set aside 750 billion Egyptian pounds in the financial year 21-22 for infrastructure, utilities, etc. And that's about 60% of the budget, actually. And over 50% of that is towards transport and logistics. So there's huge investment needed in many different areas, in roads, and maybe that's the biggest really visible change that has happened in Egypt, but also in supply warehouses for strategic commodities that need to be throughout the country, in dry ports, in port terminals, in rail transport and subways, and also in river transport. And so there's a need across the board, really. And so the government created a law for public-private partnerships, and that was way back in 2010. But now they've come to a realization that there need to be changes. They need to make the approval process easier. They need to allow different flexibility in the types of contracts that are allowed, and they need to give more access for the private sector to funding. And so recently there were some amendments also to that law, and there have been a lot of public-private partnerships announced or in the pipeline. But I think that it's not always smooth sailing for the private sector to work with the government. It's there are a lot of challenges, and I really believe that there are three areas that need to be there, or three success factors that have to be there for the private sector to be able to work well with the government. And the first one is to have a clear delineation of the roles. Is the government a regulator? Is it a partner? How do you make sure that there's no head-to-head competition between the government and the private sector? And that's always a big challenge.
Especially in pseudo-government companies.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
Sorry, that's the...
And the second thing is really to have a kind of alignment of the goals between the public sector and the private sector, to make sure that any deals that come about are done in a win-win way. The private sector has to feel that it's going to benefit, and the public sector also needs to benefit. And finally, and maybe most importantly, is building trust. I think that there has to be a sharing of the risks also, and that's what can scare sometimes the private sector when it comes into some of these large things. And if I were to add a fourth one, I would say, how do you widen and level the playing field so that more medium-sized businesses are also attracted into that kind of work, because now it's very much dominated by the huge players.
Ma'moon, anything you would like to add to this?
Yeah, in addition to infrastructure investment, I think this should also be taken into account, assessed in a way that's holistic, right? You can't, for instance, just open up or just look at the dry port on its own, but what would the impact be on, say, the terminal or the trucking sector? Referring back to this study that I did, we did a simulation model that looked at the Aqaba container terminal and played around with different policies and investment decisions that could have been taking place outside of the different scenarios, basically. And one of the scenarios was to open up a dry port, and we wanted to see the implications. It didn't yield the most attractive or the most the most attractive outcome, and the reason was because the national fleet size was not adjusted. So keeping everything else all equal, one infrastructure investment might not, when looking at it on a holistic view, might not yield the desired outcome. So what I'm saying is, we need to revisit, look at the whole chain, look at the different processes, and number two, digital transformation, try to add in technology as much as possible. Three is education. So I think, as you both highlighted earlier, we're hearing more and more talks about supply chains, post this pandemic. It's really been at the center point. And this is good because now people are more aware about supply chains and their impact, and transportation, logistics, and how this impacts their business, their bottom lines. So supply chains are no longer seen as just cost control centers, but also revenue generators, right? So if I can't deliver on time, then I might lose a sale.
Yes, I think spot on, and I think, Abir, what you've mentioned on PPP, your 4 points that you've highlighted were spot on. We all believe, I think, in PPP projects, but I come also from the private sector, and I've seen how when the governments do not have this PPP mentality, how much it affects actually the ability of the private sector to go into and participate into these PPP. That's for one. And I have seen the difference between governments when a government actually pushes you to innovate, gives you the freedom as a private sector to innovate, versus a government that looks at you and tries to, limit your innovation and growth as a private sector. That is a huge impact for what the private sector can actually help in implementations. One thing when we were talking that came to mind, when we are talking about regional trade and regional cooperation, one of the points that was also highlighted, I think, in a session yesterday was actually data. And, logistics also has a lot of data. Whether it's the data of the containers, the data of the cargo inside the containers, massive amounts of data. And when I'm talking, I'm thinking about how much data we as NAFID collect, massive amounts of data that can give us massive reports. But one of the challenges of regional actually trade is actually the data, the privacy of the data, and what sometimes governments perceive as private data, while most data in the logistics sector is actually public data. You go into a lot of these websites, you can track your container without, anybody else's interference. So what do you think about data and how we can actually maybe cross that bridge, hopefully one day? Mamoun, I'd like to start with you since you're in the data and IT space.
Yeah, and you are too. I mean, like you said, there's a lot of data, especially in transportation, that's being underutilized. And I think a big part of it is because of, for lack of a better word, is education. We do not know how to use this data. We do not know how to, we should have some sort of KPIs in place and be able to make sense of this data. With NAFTA, like the flow of trucks, there's tons of things that the government and even business owners can make use of. Let me give you an example of how we've been able to successfully use data. So for instance, in the past, a vessel discharging in Aqaba, the receivers, I'm talking about a vessel of grains discharging that might go, that might use about 300 truckloads per day, go to multiple receivers, right? Let's say from 10 to 15 per day. Those receivers wouldn't know what's coming in on time, so there's a lot of guesswork, and guesswork creates costs, right? Because you need to keep people on standby. So what we've been able to successfully do was give them access to a portal where they're seeing each truckload that's being loaded on real-time basis, and then once they discharge them in their facility, they can scan the proof of delivery, and like this triggers a confirmation for the transporter.
Abir, would you like to add to the data privacy?
I just want to say that I think that's really a huge area of development and growth in the next few years. There's already been a lot of development, but it's very key to everything that we've been talking about. Without looking at the data and doing the right kind of analysis, you can never achieve resilience or flexibility or cost reduction or sustainability. You need to be able to see where things are moving and how the different factors. I really like the example that you gave about the dry port and how you looked at it holistically and put all the factors together. You need to be able to build models. You need to be able to really analyze. So I think that in the future, there's going to be more and more of that. And there will be a job called supply chain analyst that's going to be really one of the most in-demand jobs in the next few years.
I totally agree. I'd like to now ask our audience if anybody has a question for the speakers. Please.
Hi, good evening. Bashar Hamoudi from Jordan Chemicals here. Actually, I have a lot of questions, but I'll start with one, maybe give some space to the audience. It was mentioned that we depend a lot on the region for growth and building a proper future. And currently, right now, we have the cases of whether reconstruction in Iraq, in Syria, or even in building a new city like Neom. Is Jordan and or Egypt, are they ready infrastructure-wise to handle such new projects? If no, then what needs to be done? Thank you.
Abir, would you like to?
I think that there are really huge gaps, and that is why the size of the investment needed in the next few years and the size of the investment that has happened, at least in Egypt, in the past few years has been so big, because I think that we spent years where there wasn't enough of that development, and we're just getting started. And you really can't create that kind of interregional trade without that happening in many countries at the same time. And maybe the impetus will be the introduction of some of these new free trade agreements that will encourage more and more countries to take advantage of those and build up their own infrastructure, and not just infrastructure, but really systems.
I can answer a little bit also from the Jordan side. I think it has been a real challenge to do cross-regional trade. As you have mentioned, you have, depending on your borders and depending on which country you're in, for Jordan it was Syria and Iraq and the conflict, it created a big issue for cross-regional trade. I think today there's a huge effort, adding to what Abir said. There are huge gaps, but there are huge efforts. One of the efforts is I like to call the Pan-Arab effort for rail connection, the rain connection, or the rail connection, basically. And I think, as you mentioned, one of the gaps in cross-regional trade is actually having each country as ready as the country next to it. Because if one country in the middle is not as ready, then you have the gap. And we really hope, I mean, I share Abir's view, we really hope that this gap will be reduced. Some countries are doing more. I think we need to also do more to close a little bit that gap.
Thank you. So my name is William Consul from MetLife Insurance. So I do believe that the magic word that occur after Corona, it's agility. So how agile you are in terms of policies, in terms of compliance. So basically, would the metaverse be part of this transformation in terms of logistics, in terms of the next step? So basically, should we be agile more into this concept?
Ma'moon, would you like to take a try? And
Sure. So I think before going into the metaverse, maybe a step back would be just digital transformation, and then maybe applying, for instance, blockchain with expediting customs clearance, documentation certifications, right? All those can be put on the blockchain. And you know, step by step, the metaverse, I mean, is a big concept. I think everyone's still trying to wrap their heads around. But there's definitely room, let's say, for digital transformation and to take it step by step.
I think to add to that, I think a lot of, before we get to the metaverse, I think a lot of IoT has gone into the logistics sector. And a lot of digitalization went into it. And as any other sector, the past 2 years have transformed a lot of how this sector works. We today depend, and again, we are as fast as the technology. Okay, but the technology is much faster than the logistics sector because this is one of the sectors that takes time to adapt to new technologies from experience. But we have seen at least a lot of people introducing IoT now starting to depend on the readings that they get from the different players. And also we see a lot of people exchanging data. Albeit they are more private sector, but they are exchanging data, and a lot of data is actually public. So when you combine all of this, I think the sector will become more agile. Maybe we are not there yet, but we see a lot of people adopting IT-related ideas and policies, exactly.
Good afternoon. Let me just come around so you can actually see me too, eh? Thank you very much. Actually, I was waiting for today's session because yesterday I brought up a question and it sort of was muted. But I'm in the food industry. My name is Ali Nur. I'm with a private industry called Kalani Food Center. With all the different sectors that rely very heavily on sea transport, you know, the food sector is one of the most important sectors where not just in Jordan, but the whole region has suffered dramatically during the COVID period because of delays. And if it's dry foods or frozen foods, not much of an issue. But when it's perishable products, it's a major issue. And a lot of imports for us have been stopped from many countries because of huge port congestions around the world, whether it's in the US from the eastern seaboard or the western seaboard. So it's wonderful to hear that there are opportunities, and I totally agree that it's a combination of both government and the private sector to have to work hand in hand. But other than sea freight, I don't think anyone addressed air freight. A comment and maybe a question, how do you see air freight actually during these periods, especially now with the current crisis, playing an important role within the Middle East? I mean, for example, just an example, RJ, Qatar Airways, Etihad, Gulf Air, forming some sort of united front where they can supply, especially those in perishable products, whether it's food or pharmaceutical industry, to both import and export to the US and to other places of the world. Do you see that as a possibility seriously? Because it would reduce costs dramatically compared to sea freight. Thank you.
Abir, I think you can help with that.
I agree that that's really a huge challenge. Recently, we actually had a meeting of the AmCham Transport and Logistics Committee in Egypt with the Agriculture Committee, and they have a lot of challenges exporting to the European market, and due to all of these disruptions in shipping, I don't think that the capacity exists now for air freight to really fill that gap. At least in Egypt, there isn't that much. Is it a big part of the solution? I believe it could be a part of the solution. Is it the solution? I don't believe it's sufficient, and it will still be quite high in cost.
But when it comes to perishable products, my question is actually to the perishable products.
Yes.
I totally agree with you when it comes to dry and frozen products and other products, you know, whether it's equipment, et cetera, and so forth. But for perishable products, I see a huge opportunity that's being missed. And, you know, there are, for example, in the meat industry, there have been imports into Jordan just prior to COVID, 30 metric tons per week on an airline. That can easily be increased dramatically if there's a coordinated effort with regional cargo airline industry. That's my question, basically.
Yeah, I agree with you. What I'm saying is that the capacity isn't there right now, and there should be something to fill that gap, but it won't solve the problem all by itself.
Yeah, Marwan.
So we're seeing businesses get creative, right? With, like, for instance, Amazon chartering a vessel, or Canadian Tire. You know, businesses are getting creative to build in that extra agility or resilience in their supply chain. And this is definitely interesting, especially when it comes to perishable, like you stated. But I think it comes down to the business, maybe forming like a conglomerate, talking. So it comes down to the idea of collaboration, and then going to the airlines. I think the supply will follow if demand is there. And if demand, let's say, is to some extent, you know, not very volatile, right? Yeah. Thank you.
It's your time.
Thank you, thank you. It's always hard to come after Ali, but you owe me a big round of cheese, okay? One of the big Dutch ones, not the little French ones, okay? But it's an honor to yield my turn to our honored member from AmCham, and it's hard to come after him. But I have a technical question. I'm Lana, I'm the head of the FTA unit, the legal advisor at AmCham. I would just want to give a little intro and then my question. We all know that all our countries joined the WTO Trade Facilitation Agreement, which has a big component on it about public-private dialogue within it. How do you see the role of AmCham locally in promoting this dialogue and making sure that the voice of the public sector and the private sector communicate well together? Coming back to Noura's point, and of course, how can we as regional AmChams collaborate together? My question is to all the distinguished speakers. Thank you for a very, very interesting question. And if you can help us identify some action items, I know that this is why we're here after all as AmCham, to work together and take advantage of the frameworks so we can push forward growth through public-private sector dialogue and collaboration. Thank you.
I think that's actually a very, very interesting question. And I see AmCham as very active in lobbying for changes to policy, for important improvements that impact the business sector and then the economy in a big way. And it is really, as Noura was saying, that for there to be a success of growing trade intra-regionally, and each country has to really step up, and they need to be talking to each other, and they need to be unifying their systems. If you're going to adopt certain, for example, blockchain and customs, if those things are integrated, then it would make a huge difference. And just as each country AmCham has a role in, pushing for that agenda within its own country, I really believe that this idea of having that kind of dialogue and putting together different heads from the business community could have an excellent impact.
And I would just have one thing to add to that. I think this is a great opportunity for the MENA region to have AmCham have a unified vision and each take it to its own government. And then maybe one point we can have actually a conference having everybody on board under the patronage of AmCham MENA to actually have a unified dialogue. There are a lot of conferences. I know everybody has their own, the customs have their conference. So I think that actually, the narrative, keeping the dialogue open, just giving everybody the pros and the cons. I don't think any two people in any government would disagree on what are the pros of actually having open borders and having proper regional trade, okay? There are some issues, okay, because, you know, I'm not with utopia, okay, and we know our region. So there are some issues for having this cross-border trade, but I think we can actually deal with them. We can make them small. Today, they always seem big. You know, we magnify the problems instead of actually magnifying the positives. So I think this narrative, we need to keep it going.
I can also add on to that as like a potential action item, maybe a series of workshop at a local level. So each AmCham within like the local members coming in to try to understand like what are their sourcing needs, what are certain challenges within their supply chains, and then you know, taking this up to a notch to the regional level, where you know, the regional AmChams can sit and maybe like in a conference, as Noura was saying, you know, then more action items can come out of that.
Any more questions? Please. Oh, okay. We'll start there.
Rina Latash from Admiral Energy. Thank you very much for the valuable insights. And Egypt will be hosting the next climate summit. Do you have any plans for the fleet electrification, and what are the challenges you are facing in the transition to the clean mobility? Thank you.
I think that where climate is concerned and where reducing carbon emissions are concerned, the challenge is for electrification, to be sure that the infrastructure is there, and I think that the government has very clear plans to just distribute a lot of charging, for example, stations. There are different choices for technologies that can be used, such as biofuels. I think that there isn't enough awareness yet in the market, in the sector. People don't know, you know, what they need to do or how quickly they need to move on it. And I don't think they will actually move on it until there starts to be more regulation around these things that are pushing companies into actually taking action. And I believe that there needs to be a mechanism around how do we support companies to deal with the costs of that kind of transition, because it's very expensive, and the transport and logistics sector has faced a lot of challenges in the past couple of years, especially with the pandemic and with all of these disruptions. And so how do you absorb that cost and have a clear understanding of it? And so I think that there need to be initiatives that engage the private sector more and more, and so that the management and the boards of all of these companies can have more of an understanding of exactly what they need to do.
And if I may add, I think most of these initiatives also come from the global players rather than the regional players. So I think that also plays a big part in that point.
He is a global player.
He is the global player. Please, your question.
Thank you, Nora and Abir and Mr. Tukan, Mr. First name. Thank you. This is a really terrific panel. My name is Benjamin Pierce. I'm from the American Embassy, the economic section. It's always a privilege to be here with AmCham, and in this case, MENA AmCham. My question is about education. Several times that word came up. It caught my ear when Abir said, supply chain analyst, this is a job that will be in demand. So you have a job that's equal parts data scientist, operations, business administration. Are our universities, whether in Jordan or Egypt or other countries, preparing individuals, students for such a career? It may require some technical restructuring in the correct college, some cross-pollinating between colleges within a university, as well as awareness. You know, our children often want to be engineers, doctors, lawyers. This isn't the kind of thing that's a household name, but it should be, because we're all sitting and drinking and around, surrounded by things that were shipped and built and transported and so forth. So anyway, I leave my question to the experts here.
So it's such an interesting time to be in education today. Like, anyone can become a lifelong learner. You know, I've done my master's at MIT, but I've seen how they've been trying to disrupt education through offering their courses online at basically for free. And they've been partnering up with like private companies, institutions, to do a tailor-made program for their supply chain departments. I think it comes down to, like, the main motivation comes from the business itself or from the surroundings. So I think this is like something maybe culturally here in Jordan we need to, or in the region, that need to push, advocate more for, is education, and education within, you know, it's not just a doctor, engineer. You know, there's other fields and there's other ways of learning. It's not just through, directly through universities, you know, on campus, like physically being there. Like there's massive, those MOOCs, massive online courses that are available today by leading institutions in the US and around the world. And I can tell you, for instance, for supply chain, MIT has actually posted their, they do offer their supply chain program online, and then you can continue going on to campus to earn a full master's degree. And they do offer, as I mentioned, something for specific catered for certain businesses. So like the content is there. It's just having that motive to go out there and chase it.
Yeah, I think I would say that I think supply chain is more and more on the table. It wasn't that important a subject, or that, you know, didn't see that much focus previously. And so now there are more, I think, dedicated university programs for that. In Egypt, there are more people interested in having that career or studying that. And there's also more innovation happening on the ground through startups, through, you know, companies that are just trying to disrupt and come up with new ways of doing things. I think the gap is in having a structured kind of cooperation between the private sector and the educational institutions, at least in Egypt. I mean, I know that in Europe, in the US, there's more of that kind of collaboration between the universities and private sector companies on research and development and on things like that. We're not seeing enough of that, I think.
I think in Jordan we share the same. One thing, I don't think we can get enough education, and I think it's more in training people, you know, after they get out of their universities, what training they need to actually be able to do the job. And I see a lot of private sector more and more investing in this training phase of you know, young fresh graduates to get them to do the supply chain or the logistics job much better. With this, I would like to thank you all, and you know, I just to look at the time, I think we're a little bit run over our session. So I would like to thank our speakers, Mrs. Abir, Mr. Mamoun, and thank this beautiful audience for all your questions. Please share with me to give them a big round of applause. Thank you.